So welcome back, listeners. Welcome back, Vicki Davutashvili, my co-host, my co-collaborator, my co-conspirator, and all other good things. We are delighted to have you with us today on the topic of psychological safety, a topic that Vicki and I have been reflecting on and thinking about covering for a while now. Certainly, I have been thinking about it a lot. And I was expressing to Vicki how significant this topic feels to me, the level of impact it can have on so many other factors that I will talk more about. And so what we're going to attempt to do today is cover some of the most important points, the points that I certainly feel more familiar with on this topic. And I'm so glad that Vicki's here because Vicki will share her experience on what she feels familiar with on this topic. And in that way, hopefully we'll cover quite a bit about this topic. And at the same time, I'm sure there's so much more to be talked about. So Vicki, really glad to have you here. Thank you so much for being my partner in this big conversation. Hi, and how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm really looking forward to this discussion because, right before we jumped into here, we said, is this bigger than us? And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I think this is so tremendously important. And everyone has had experiences of psychological safety or lack thereof. And so I think that this is an incredibly important and impactful conversation for us to delve into. So I'm really excited, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Afsheen, because I'd love to get your perspectives, insights on this, and let's see where this conversation takes us today.
Yeah, let's just dive in and see where we go. Let's keep swimming. So here we go, swimming into psychological safety today. And I'm going to start off our conversation with helping us ground ourselves in why is psychological safety important, and some research done by Accenture in which they actually leveraged a ton of sources like Gartner's and Gallup's research and Harvard Business Review articles. So they assimilated all of the more recent thinking on this topic to try to understand what is it that psychological safety actually drives in our organizations. And I think that's a really important place to start, because I think it's really important for us to know why we are having this conversation and why it feels so important and big. So I'm going to share with you what I know of this, and that is that $600 billion a year is lost on employee turnover globally. And in contrast, Accenture has found, based on all the research that it's done, that companies that engineer high levels of psychological safety experience numerous benefits. And you'll see them pop up over my shoulder in a minute, but I'll share them with you here as well. 27% reduction in turnover, 76% more engagement, 50% more productivity, 74% less stress, and the list goes on. So the case for psychological safety is tremendous. And what that might enable organizations to do in terms of lower their turnover, raise their engagement, and thereby raise discretionary effort in the organization is phenomenal. And so given that and the context in which we operate nowadays, where we are in an increasingly sort of turbulent, fast-paced, fast-changing ecosystem in which our organizations and our employees are operating, the need for psychological safety is even more, because a lot of the times we're operating in the unknown, and operating in the unknown creates feelings of risk, fear, uncertainty. And those are the kinds of experiences that can actually take away from innovation, creativity, which is what is needed to tackle the adaptive challenges that we face in the environment we work in today. So by creating and harnessing and holding a space for psychological safety, we are able to counter the external impacts that we as organizations, as individuals, face on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to stop here and just would love to hear your thoughts, Vicki, on what I've just shared and sort of what that created for you.
Yeah, no, I think number one, the data is astounding and very sobering, right? Mm-hmm. It's funny because we today focus so much on psychological safety. And I love the fact that you start with the why, right? And the why being both the hard business outcomes and implications that there are to the lack of psychological safety when it comes to employee engagement, but then also the emotional aspect of it, of people not feeling like they can take risks, right? Because that's what psychological safety is how safe do you feel to take a risk in your culture, in your environment, with your team. And I'm going to bring a very practical lens to this, and I'll share with you two experiences that I have had, and let's see where that takes us. Mm-hmm. So the first experience I want to share with you is one of me being the employee who did not have psychological safety. Mm-hmm. So 15 years ago, so my daughter is 14, 15 years ago, I was pregnant. And when I got pregnant, again, granted, this is going back 15 years ago, I did not feel the psychological safety to really announce at work about being pregnant, and was really worried about what that meant for my career, in all honesty. And that was a moment of huge discomfort. And like you said, it's a point in your life where it's an unknown and you don't know how the organization, how your manager, how your team is going to react to that, right? And the things that were going through my mind was, okay, so are they going to think now that I'm no longer engaged? Are they going to pass me up for promotions? Are they going to pass me up for the shiny projects, right? Because they're basically going to figure that I'm not as involved and engaged, right, at work and in my career. And so that was definitely a moment for me in my life that really stands out, when I didn't really feel the psychological safety to be my whole authentic self. And especially when I had small kids, same thing, right? When things were coming up where I needed to be there for my kids, not really feeling the safety to say look, I need to lean into my child for these 2 hours, and then I'll lean into work in the evening for work, right? And balancing my life that way. So that was a moment where I felt like I was at risk with my career, right? And that absolutely put a pause on my career for a couple of years, because I did become, while I continued to work and I continued to show up, I was not nearly as engaged, as creative, as productive as maybe I would have been had I had a manager who really made me feel very seen and supported as a young mother dealing with children, who made me feel like they truly understood where I was as a human and was creating the space for me to be as good of a parent and as good and creative as an employee as I could have been. So I'll pause there. I'll share with you that as an employee. And then I can share with you 15 years later where I had an experience at work recently where I needed to be sensitive and I needed to create the space and the psychological safety for my team member on my team and how I reacted in that moment. So I want to pause here. I want to give you a chance to react and to add to this, and then we can talk about the other side of it.
Yeah, I think it's so important what you shared, and I'll tell you what's coming up for me as you shared it. I'm reflecting on a project that Google carried out called the Aristotle Project that was trying to figure out what it was that made teams working on different projects more productive and more successful than other teams. And they pulled together as many data points as they could possibly find, including who was on that teams, what subjects they were doing, what skill sets they had. They collected so many data points for so many years. And in the end, despite having all those data points, they could not pinpoint the reason why certain teams did better than others. They just could not find the common denominator. And then they happened to come upon this concept of psychological safety being the glue that held certain teams together so much more effectively than others, and therefore made those teams more successful than others. There is no tangible way to instill psychological safety in a system, right? It's not as though there's a balance sheet and you can see the numbers of how a business is doing. It's not as though there's a policy and the policy is on the topic of psychological safety. You can have HR policies on the topic of how much leave you take in a year, right? Psychological safety sits within the nuances of all of those tangibles of your organization. So it's about the intention, how those little pearls of intention get gathered through the policies and the procedures and the way we behave and the way we speak to our employees. And those pearls add up to create psychological safety. And I think that's probably why people really struggle with this topic and why it feels so big. Because it has to come from a place of intention. And then it only gets reflected within the nuances of the processes that we have in place and of the way we behave. And I got to wondering, what were those nuances that you were missing in your experience 15 years ago that would have reassured you that you could be psychologically safe? And so I'm going to stop here. And that's kind of my question is, what would you have loved to see, or what would have reassured you?
Oh, I love this question. And this light, like this lens that you're bringing into it, because I've never thought about that. But let me reflect on that question. I think it's a really important question. So, number one, I think it would have been just really nice for my manager to acknowledge it, to just come out and say, like, look, I know that you have a small child. Like, I get it. And I just want you to know that I understand that sometimes your kid might get sick and you need to take them to the doctor. I understand that sometimes you might need to run out of the office early. I get it. I totally get it. All I ask is, let's just work together as a team. And when those things come up, let's figure out, how do we make it work so that you continue to bring your best self to work, and so that I can support you as a manager. Oh my God, that would have blown me away. And that would have created the type of loyalty in me where I would want to work harder for a manager that was this supportive. That's number one. Number two is just to sometimes even ask me hey, how's your baby? Are you enjoying your time with your baby? Just acknowledging that this is such a big part of my life, that acknowledgement, right? And giving me the forum to kind of say, oh, my baby just rolled over, or whatever, right? Like those big moments that you experience as a person, right? As a mom, as a new mom. And those nuances would have made me feel like it's okay to bring my motherhood to work, while also bringing my most creative, my most excited version of myself, who wants to come up with new ideas or go above and beyond for my team. Whereas what happened to me was what I think happens to a lot of people, we start to stagnate, right? You just like show up and you coast. You show up, you know you're smart, you know you're capable, you know your job, but you're like, you know, you're not going to give that extra 10%. And it's that extra 10% where 90% of probably the value comes from, right? In an employee. And so that is the nuance that I would have loved to have experienced. And I was just never getting that in that environment.
I hear you. And it's interesting, right? Because it all goes back rather to intention than some kind of policy, right?
Yes.
It all goes back to intention rather than a P&L. It goes back to intention, which is so nuanced,
Yeah.
you know, that it's really, really a lot more difficult to tangibly demonstrate how to make that happen. But if it's not happening, it will be so obvious, right? And that's the other thing is, if the intention's not there, it becomes so clear so quickly, because you will see it and experience it in the many nuances of your day-to-day work, right? I was thinking about how we write out or how we articulate hybrid work policies as an example, right? And how in articulating hybrid work policies, there's a tone that can be used, which is, you are expected to be here 3 days a week. These are the days. And if you are not, these are the consequences. In the tone that I just shared, that does not at all reflect any level of care for the psychological safety of the employee, who might be facing issues on occasion around childcare. They might be facing issues around elder care, whatever that might be, which might not make it possible for them sometimes to follow those policies. And the wording in that policy sounds quite forbidding. Whereas if we decide that, sure, this is how we'd like to use these policies more as a guideline, and within that articulate also our trust, our understanding of the occasional happenings that life happens to each of us, and of course we'll allow the employee to navigate that as best as they can, and within their own within what works for them. I don't know if I'm articulating this very well, but it's just that it's in the intention of trying to take into account how this is driving psychological safety at every touch point that we have with the employee, at every touch point, rather than a statement on a wall. You know? And I think that's what people are looking for. They're not looking for the statement on the wall that says, we care about psychological safety. They are looking for, where is this showing up in my day-to-day interactions with all the touch points that exist that touch me?
Yep, 1,000%. And so I swear, for the person that is listening right now, Afsheen is not paying me to say this, but this is why I believe that coaching is so incredibly important. This is where that inner work that you go through as a human and as a leader, that is when you can become, I'm going to call it a conscious leader, and you can really be present with the way that you are coming across with other people, and the way that you're making other people feel when they're in your space, and the way that you create space for them. And I can tell you, I've gone through coaching myself, and it has absolutely shifted me in so many ways as a leader as well, because as I did my inner work and I became very present with, how do I want to be made feel? How do I feel right? How do I feel? And that is the way that I want to make other people feel as well as a leader. And as a leader, what you're doing is you're both focusing on the human aspects, the day-to-day human aspects of leading a team, as well as driving the business outcomes. But the business outcomes will not be there until you invest in yourself as a leader and until you invest in your team. And creating a culture where your team is thriving and understanding what does it mean for your team and each of your team members to thrive. And it is out of that the business outcomes are going to come through. And so, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that. And then I do want to share with you about an example. I dealt with a circumstance where psychological safety was needed. And it was because of the coaching, it was because of the inner work that I had done that I was very present and aware of that. And it's not that the employee asked me for it, I volunteered it, just the same way that I had wished in my past people would have volunteered it with me. So I want to pause here. I want to give you, Afsheen, an opportunity to respond, and then I'll share with you about this.
Thank you. I so absolutely agree with you. And I really love sort of the intentionality that you're suggesting in what you're going to share next. And before you do that, one of the things that I wanted to bring up also was that, who coined this term psychological safety, and where did it all begin? And, it's important to me for several reasons. One, it's become a catchphrase, but in a way, it's also become a catch-all. And so I think it's really important for us to understand sort of the guardrails within which this phrase can be used or is being used. And then the second piece is because it was, of course, coined by a female scientist or female professor of leadership at Harvard, just to call that out as well. That, the person who articulated this and who sort of discovered this is Amy Edmondson, and she's a professor of leadership and management at Harvard Business School. And she defined psychological safety in her early work as the ability to speak up in a work environment without the fear of being humiliated or penalized. I think the only thing I would add to that, I think it continues to grow as we become more familiar with this concept, is it's not just about speaking up in a work environment without fear of being humiliated and penalized. It's also about showing up in an environment without the fear of being humiliated and penalized. For example, your example of being a mother, right? Any other example of needing to take time out to look after an elderly parent, being able to show up at work without the fear of being humiliated or penalized for having a disability, for being different, whatever that might be. Psychological safety is, to me, about being able to speak up and show up in a work environment without the fear of being humiliated or penalized. And I think it's a massive enabler of inclusion as a result. So in a way, if we are able to bring our intention of psychological safety into the nuances of everything that touches our employees, we are giving them a feeling of and an experience of safety as well as being inclusive as an employer. And I think that is such an important point to me to make at this juncture. So I'm very curious now. One, because I see you shaking your head and, vehemently agreeing. So I would love to hear your thought back on that. And also, I want to hear your example as well.
Yeah, I love that. And I was listening to Simon Sinek yesterday, and he was talking in this clip, and he was saying, it used to be that you showed up at work and there was loyalty from the employee to the company and the company to the employee, and it was this understood thing. He goes, but now, what the new generation of employees is looking for is not just do you come into work and do interesting work, but you want friendships there, and you want to belong there, and you want your community there, and you want and he's like, and employees are looking for the company to basically be like all of these things that different elements of society used to fulfill for you as a human being, right? And so the dynamics of what the employee is looking for today is very different too, right? And so when you think about what is it that brings an employee or wants an employee to keep coming back, he was saying how all of these people are leaving work, and when they ask them why, because I'm burnt out. It's like, what? When do you quit? Just because you were burnt out? He goes, but this new generation will literally up and quit. That's what they will do. So if you really want to retain your employees, you need to almost be all of these things. You need to be community, you need to be a friend, you need to be a therapist, you need to be a place of creativity, you need to be all of these things. And so it's interesting because I just recently launched my community, and I really had to pause, and I said, well, why am I even launching this community? Well, because people want to feel seen, they want to feel heard, they want to feel understood, they want to feel safe, and they want a sense of belonging. And we look for those same elements at work, within our nuclear teams and within the broader team culture of the organization. So that's why I was shaking my head in vehement agreement with you, because absolutely, this is exactly what we're speaking to. And, part of when you take a risk as an employee, the way that the employer responds and reacts to you absolutely makes or breaks whether you want to continue to stay with that company. So here's an example that I had on my team recently. So back in September, I had my star employee leave the organization, and she was kind of like the mother hen, if I could describe her. She was that super empathetic, smart, driven employee that you just dream of having on your team. And it's interesting because she would advocate hiring people from within the organization for the more junior roles, because she was so passionate about developing the talent that we already had in the company. And I was super supportive of listen, if this is the way that you want to build out your team, I'm very supportive of that. But as a result, she was bringing in people with very little experience in the discipline that they were being hired for. And she was willing to go the extra mile to coach them, to train them, and to really up-level them. But then she decided to leave because of her own personal reasons. And so that now created this really interesting dynamic where, her expertise level is gone. And I had these more junior people on the team who really didn't have a lot of experience in the discipline, needing to step up, right? And to backfill some of the gap that was going to be there temporarily. And I remember having the first conversation with them. And, she would always say to me in my one-on-ones, Vicki, they really listen to what you say. Vicki, they're dying to have more exposure to you. And, so she would sprinkle these things in with me. So I knew that when she left, they would be very afraid of, what does this mean for me? Oh my God, am I going to get exposed as a fraud, as not knowing enough in the discipline? Am I going to fail somehow? Do I have what it takes for me to step into this more leadership role? I've never done strategy before. And I knew that this was going through their minds. The other thing that I also knew is that they stepped into a role with a very mother hen caring manager. And I think they were really scared about, well, what kind of manager is Vicki going to now bring into me? Right? And what does this mean for my day-to-day? What if it's going to be somebody who's a ball buster, right? Versus somebody who's really caring and is nurturing. I knew that all of these things were going through their minds. And so I called a very short, cozy meeting with them. It was over online. And they were very quiet and reserved in the first conversation. And of course I was like, listen, guys, I understand, et cetera, et cetera. And I just kind of paused and I just looked at them and I said, guys, why don't you level with me? Like, how are you really feeling? How are you feeling? And then I started bringing it up. I said, are you scared? Are you a little uncomfortable? Are you feeling like, oh my God, what does this all mean to me? And then I said, listen, I want you to know that I am perfectly okay with failing. I'm perfectly okay with making mistakes. We make mistakes, we fail, and we learn from them. And as long as we have a culture of learning and growing together, I'm like, it's totally fine. I want you to know that in no way, shape, or form will I hold this against you. I will, in fact, be so impressed and proud of you for taking the low-level risks. Let's do this together. Please know that you have an advocate in me. If you need to, you can have me on speed dial. Just call me on Teams. And I could see them starting to like smile as I was talking. Like they really went from this like, and you watch for people's body and for their facial expressions and what is it telling you, right? And you become so in tune with all of that. And so and then I saw them kind of like, they go, oh, like, you know, and they didn't breathe a sigh of relief, but I could feel it in their essence, you know. Then they smiled, and literally this is exactly how we operated. I was on speed dial for them. I was you know, they'd be like, Vicki, what do you think? Like they didn't know a lot of things, and it was okay. And then they were like fighting battles that were not theirs to fight. And I would say, listen, this is not your battle to fight right now. This is your learning opportunity. And I would, you know, shine a light on that for them. And so in the end of it, they said to me, they were like, Vicki, I've never felt this empowered in my career. It felt so empowered at the end of that journey together. And it's been like a 6-month journey for us, right? And you can literally, through psychological safety, you can allow people the spaciousness to really step up, number one, to grow, to learn, to thrive, and to discover inner strength, power, strategy, creativity that they never even knew was there. And it's a way to create lemonade out of lemons. And so I'm so proud and I'm so happy that my team had the opportunity to experience that for themselves. I can talk about this forever.
I know, and so you should be so proud. And I think that there's such a important lesson there around being willing to lean into and being ready to lean into what is a largely undefined, largely felt experience that many of us as leaders are not prepared to embrace yet. And I think more leaders need to become comfortable with that way of that intentionality and that acting into that intention without and be willing to take the risk to try, even if they don't do an excellent job of it the first few times. Because the skill set for leadership is just changing very quickly, and we cannot rely any longer on the kinds of skills that were valued in leadership 10, 20 years ago. It's evolved. It's evolved very quickly, sometimes at a pace that maybe we are not ready to get our arms around. But coaching, as you said, is super helpful in helping us to do that, bring it into the way we show up for ourselves and also for our teams in the organization, mainly to drive business results. I mean, in the end, going back to the why, because it drives business results. So Thank you, Vicki, for a great conversation today. I have enjoyed this. We've just run out of time. How did that happen? What a big topic. We knew it was going to be a big topic for us, and it turned out to be a huge one. So thanks.
Thank you. And, if there's anything that you can take away from this conversation, number one is invest in yourself as a leader, and be very in tune and sensitive to what someone else might be going through. And always try to treat the people on your team the way that you wish to be treated. And out of that, you are going to inspire your employees during a difficult moment. And through that inspiration, tremendous business results and outcomes are going to be experienced in the organization.